The moment I opened that app on my phone and saw the live feed from my kitchen, my hand started shaking so bad I had to pull off Highway 9 and park on the gravel shoulder like a man who just got the wind knocked clean out of him. Because what I was watching, what was playing on that little screen in real time, wasn't what I thought I'd installed that camera for. It wasn't what I expected. It wasn't even close to the thing I had prepared my heart for. And trust me, I had prepared myself for a lot. I had played out every possible scenario in my head. Every single one except this. I sat there in my truck, engine still running, hazard lights blinking, cars flying past me at 70 miles an hour. And I just stared at that screen. My mouth was dry. My chest felt like someone had parked a truck on it. A bigger truck than the one I was sitting in. I looked at what was happening in my own home, in the house I had worked 12-hour shifts to pay for, in the kitchen where I had made my sick wife soup every single morning for the past 8 months. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. I felt like a fool. And then I picked up my phone and I dialed 911. My name is Daniel Cruz. I am 44 years old. I live, or I used to live, peacefully in a medium-sized house on the outskirts of Clarksville, Tennessee. I work in logistics management for a regional distribution company, which is a fancy way of saying I make sure other people's stuff gets from point A to point B without falling off a truck. I've been doing it for 17 years. I'm good at it. I'm organized. I pay attention to detail. I notice when things don't line up, which makes what happened to me feel even more embarrassing, if I'm being honest. Because I missed it. For months, I missed it. I'm not a particularly dramatic man. I don't have a big personality. I'm the kind of guy who shows up on time, keeps his word, fixes things around the house on weekends, and genuinely enjoys a quiet evening on the back porch with a cold drink and the sound of crickets. I'm not flashy. I drove the same Ford F-150 for 9 years before I finally replaced it with another Ford F-150. I know who I am. I met my wife, Tanya, at a company cookout back in 2010. She was the sister of a coworker. She laughed loud and often. And she had this way of looking at you like you were the most interesting person in the room, even when you absolutely were not. I fell for her hard. We were married within 2 years. For a long time, a good long time, it was everything I had hoped marriage would be. Not perfect, but real. Not always easy, but worth it. Then things started to shift. Slowly at first, like the way a house settles. You don't notice it until you find a crack in the wall one day and realize it's been forming for years. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers. But I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these stories matter. Now, where were we? Right? The crack in the wall. It started about 2 years ago, when Tanya started saying she wasn't feeling well. Headaches, fatigue, nausea. She went to the doctor, and the doctor ran some tests. And for a while there was genuine concern about something serious. Blood work came back with some irregular numbers. She was referred to a specialist. The specialist ordered more tests, more waiting. During all of that, I was right there. I took time off work. I drove her to appointments. I sat in those waiting rooms with the terrible fluorescent lighting and the magazines from 2019, and I held her hand. I want you to understand that when I say I took care of her, I mean I actually took care of her. I cooked. I cleaned. I handled the bills. I managed insurance paperwork, which, if you've never tried to navigate American health insurance while your wife might be seriously sick, is basically a part-time job designed by people who hate you personally. I did all of it. I did it because I loved her. I did it because that's what you do. Eventually, the doctors couldn't find anything definitive. The diagnosis was vague, something about chronic fatigue and possible autoimmune involvement, but nothing conclusive. Tanya said she still felt terrible. She stopped going to work. She spent most days in bed or on the couch. She became, in her words, too exhausted to do much of anything. I believed her. Of course I believed her. She was my wife. Enter Greg Holloway. Greg is Tanya's older brother. He's 49, recently divorced, and is the kind of man who has an opinion on everything and zero self-awareness about how often his opinions are wrong. He wears expensive sneakers and uses the word literally more than any adult human being should. He smells like the cologne section of a department store. I have never, in the 12 years I've known him, seen him do a single thing that was hard or uncomfortable. But he loves his sister, or so I thought. That was never something I questioned. When Tanya got sick, Greg started coming around more. Once a week, usually on Tuesdays while I was at work, he'd come by in the afternoon, check on her, bring things, food, magazines, whatever she needed. I appreciated it genuinely. It took some pressure off me knowing someone was with her during the day. For the first few months, I didn't think anything of it. Then I started noticing small things. The way Tanya would get a little, I don't know how to describe it, a little brighter on Tuesday evenings when I came home. Not dramatically so, but enough that I noticed. The way she sometimes seemed to have more energy on those nights. The way she'd be a little distant, like she was somewhere else in her head. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself I was a stressed, tired man who was projecting. I told myself a lot of things because the alternative was something I didn't want to think about. But the thing about me, the thing I mentioned earlier about paying attention to detail, is that I can't turn it off. It's not a choice. It's just how my brain is wired. And my brain kept flagging things. One Tuesday, I left work early because of a migraine. I texted Tanya to let her know I was on my way home. Greg's car was in the driveway. I went inside. They were in the living room, and they jumped when I came in, and Greg made some joke about me sneaking up on people. And Tanya looked, there's no other word for it. She looked caught. Not guilty necessarily, but caught. Like she'd been doing something she didn't want interrupted. They were just sitting on the couch. There was nothing obviously wrong. Greg left pretty quickly after that. Tanya said she was tired and went to lie down. I stood in my kitchen holding my keys, with my migraine getting worse by the minute, and I thought, something is off. So I ordered a camera. I want to be very clear. I didn't install it because I thought my wife was having an affair. I genuinely wasn't sure what I thought. My gut was telling me something. But my gut and my heart were having a serious argument, and neither one was winning. I installed it because I'm a man who needs to know things. I installed it because not knowing was making me feel insane. I installed it because I thought maybe I'd see nothing strange at all and I could finally relax. I put it in the kitchen, tucked into the corner near the cabinets, pointed toward the kitchen table and the area that opened into the living room. It was small, wireless, looked like a USB charger. Nobody would notice it unless they were specifically looking. That was a Thursday. The next Tuesday, I got to work at 7 in the morning like always. Open my phone around 2 in the afternoon, open the camera app, and press live view. And that's how I ended up on the shoulder of Highway 9, staring at my phone like a man who has just been informed that everything he thought was true is actually not. Because what I saw was this. My wife, my chronically fatigued, barely able to get off the couch, too exhausted to cook or clean or work wife, was standing at the kitchen counter, completely upright, completely alert, animated in a way I hadn't seen in months. She was talking fast, using her hands, laughing. Not tired laughing, really laughing. The kind of laughing that takes energy. The kind of laughing that doesn't happen when you're suffering from debilitating fatigue. And Greg was sitting at my kitchen table, across from her, with what looked like a bunch of papers spread out between them. Papers. I squinted at the screen. I zoomed in as much as the app allowed. My hands were steady for about 15 seconds. And then they weren't anymore. The papers. I couldn't read them clearly from the camera angle. But I could see enough. I could see what looked like official documents. I could see what looked like highlighted sections. I could see Greg pointing at something and Tanya nodding. And then Tanya saying something and both of them laughing again. My wife, who that morning had told me she was having a bad day and probably wouldn't be able to eat much, and could I please pick up some broth on the way home? I watched them for 4 minutes. I watched my wife move around that kitchen with the ease and energy that she hadn't shown me in the better part of a year. I watched her pour 2 glasses of water, hand one to Greg, sit down across from him. I watched her lean over the papers and draw something with a pen. I watched them look like 2 people who were planning something. And then I called 911. Now, let me be honest with you, when the dispatcher answered, I wasn't entirely sure what I was calling about. I said something like, I think something is happening at my house and I need someone to go there. The dispatcher was patient. She asked me to be more specific. I said I wasn't sure exactly what I was seeing, but I thought maybe it involved fraud. She asked if I thought anyone was in danger. I said I didn't think so. She said she'd send someone to do a wellness check and that I should stay calm. Staying calm was not on the agenda, but I appreciated the suggestion. I sat on that shoulder for 45 minutes. I watched the live feed the whole time. I watched Tanya and Greg finish whatever they were doing with the papers. Watched Greg put them in a folder and put the folder in his bag. Watched them chat. Watched Tanya, and this part really got me. Watched Tanya go back to the couch, pull a blanket over herself, and suddenly transform back into the exhausted, unwell woman I had been caring for. Like flipping a switch. One moment she's animated and fully functional. The next moment she's back in sick person mode, arranged on the couch like a woman who can barely lift her arms. She practiced it. She actually lay there and adjusted herself until she looked right. I watched her do it. And that was the moment the hurt cracked open into something harder, something colder, something that felt a lot less like pain and a lot more like determination. I want you to take a breath right now, because I promise you, we haven't even gotten to the worst part yet. I know. But if you're still with me, I need you to stick around, because what happened next, what I found out after I kept digging, is so much bigger than a man lying on a couch. The police arrived at my house. I watched on the feed as Tanya answered the door, moving slowly, looking exhausted, a total picture of a sick woman. She was very convincing. I will give her that. She talked to the officer for a few minutes. Greg had apparently left through the back, because when the officer came in and looked around, Greg wasn't there. The officer did a quick check, saw nothing concerning, left. I drove home. I want to tell you what I felt during that drive, but I think the more important thing to tell you is what I decided. I decided that I wasn't going to walk in there and explode. I wasn't going to yell or accuse or throw things. Not because I'm some kind of saint, but because somewhere during those 45 minutes on the highway shoulder, something in me had clicked into a very specific gear. The gear that says, don't tip your hand. Don't let them know, because knowing something that someone else doesn't know, that's not just information. That's power. I came home with broth because I had said I'd bring broth, and bringing broth was normal Daniel behavior, and I was going to be very, very normal Daniel for a little while longer. I kissed Tanya on the forehead. I asked how her day was. She said, quiet, just rested. I nodded and said, good. You need the rest. I made dinner. I sat across from her at the same kitchen table where she had been laughing and planning with her brother 3 hours earlier, and I smiled, and I asked her if she wanted more soup. She said, yes, please. I gave her more soup. I am a very patient man. Over the next 2 weeks, I did what I should have done months ago. I started paying very close attention to everything. Not in an obvious way, not the kind of attention that makes people nervous. The quiet kind, the kind that builds a picture. I went through our finances. I know, I probably should have been doing this already. But when you're in the middle of caring for someone and managing work and just trying to survive, you tend to trust that the financial stuff is fine. Tanya handled most of our joint account. I handled my personal account and the savings. We had a system. I trusted the system. The system had been tampered with. Over the past 14 months, there had been regular transfers from our joint account, small enough not to immediately trigger alarm, consistent enough to add up to something significant. The transfers went to an account I didn't recognize. When I looked closer, and I'm in logistics, I know how to trace the movement of things. I found that the account belonged to a company called Holloway Property Solutions, LLC. Greg Holloway. I sat very still for a long time when I found that. Because Greg Holloway, as far as I had always known, was not in real estate or property. He was in between jobs, as he always seemed to be. He drove a nice car and wore expensive sneakers and had, apparently, been quietly receiving money from my joint account for over a year. And then I found the rest. This is the part where I need you to understand that what happened next was not just a betrayal of marriage. It was something that had been planned, structured, thought through. And the fact that it was that deliberate, that it wasn't just passion or impulse or two people falling into something. That's what made it feel like the floor had opened up beneath me. Here is what I found piece by piece over about 10 days of very careful, very quiet investigation. Tanya was not sick. She had never been sick. The irregular blood work, she had a friend, a woman she'd known since college, someone I'd met maybe twice, who worked as a phlebotomy technician at the lab. The samples that had been flagged as irregular had been tampered with. Not enough to trigger a serious investigation, just enough to make the numbers look off, enough to create concern, enough to get me invested in the idea that my wife was unwell. The illness was a performance, a long-sustained, remarkably well-executed performance designed to do one specific thing: get me to feel responsible for her, get me to feel guilty about her, get me to be too grateful that she was still alive to look too closely at the money. Because the plan, and there was absolutely a plan, I found evidence of it, was to run down our joint savings as much as possible, get me to agree to refinance the house in both our names at an inflated rate, then for Tanya to file for divorce, citing that she could not live with a man who had refused to adequately support her medical needs. She had emails, which I accessed through our shared family tablet, that she had apparently forgotten I could get into. She had emails with Greg discussing timelines, discussing how much more they needed to transfer, discussing what a divorce attorney had told her about Tennessee property division laws. Greg was not her brother checking in on a sick sibling. Greg was her financial advisor in a scheme to take a significant portion of everything I had worked for. And based on some of the more personal emails, the kind I really did not enjoy reading, he was also something else to her that I will not describe in detail because I have some dignity left and I'd like to keep it. I need you to understand how strange it is to feel everything at once. The betrayal, the anger, the grief, because I had loved this woman. The humiliation of having been taken care of, not by her, but by the image of her suffering, which I tended to like it was real. The dark humor of it, because at some point you just have to laugh at yourself a little. I had been bringing this woman soup. I had been managing her fake insurance paperwork. I had been losing sleep over her well-being. And she had been every Tuesday while I was at work, sitting at my kitchen table in perfect health, planning my financial destruction with her accomplice, who may or may not have also been her boyfriend, and who absolutely was her older brother by blood, which adds a layer of complicated that I am not equipped to unpack here. Here's the part where I have to tell you something important. I did not go off. I know. You want me to go off. I wanted to go off. But I kept hearing this voice in my head. It sounded suspiciously like my father, who passed in 2018, and who was the most methodical man I've ever known. And the voice said, If you react with emotion, you lose. If you react with evidence, you win. So I built a case. I documented everything. The camera footage, all of it, over 3 weeks, stored on a cloud drive. The bank records, the email chain, the name of the attorney Tanya had consulted, the registration documents for Holloway Property Solutions, LLC, the connection between Greg's company and the account receiving our money. I put it all in a folder. Then I created a backup of the folder. Then I created a backup of the backup because I work in logistics and I understand that things get lost when you most need them. I also did something that I want you to pay attention to because this is the part that really changed everything. I called a lawyer of my own. His name is Raymond Holt, and he has been practicing family law in Tennessee for 23 years. He is not flashy. He does not have a billboard with his face on it. He is just extraordinarily good at what he does, and he is not particularly interested in your feelings, which at that moment was exactly what I needed in an attorney. I needed someone who would look at what I had, tell me what it was worth, and tell me what to do with it. Raymond looked at everything I gave him. He took about a week, and then he called me and said very calmly, as if he were commenting on the weather, "Daniel, this is not just a divorce case." He meant it was also a civil fraud case, potentially a criminal one. The unauthorized transfers from the joint account were legally theft. Tanya was a co-owner of the account, so her liability was complex, but Greg's was not. Greg had received those funds. Greg had a company that had received those funds. Greg had emails clearly discussing the intentional nature of what they were doing. And the lab technician who had tampered with the blood work, she had potential criminal liability there too. Raymond filed for divorce on my behalf on a Wednesday morning. He did it quietly, with no announcement. I had already moved my personal savings to an account Tanya didn't know about. I had already spoken to HR at my company about adjusting how my direct deposit was split. I had already made sure the house paperwork was secure. And then because timing is everything and because I am at my core a logistics man, I served her the papers on a Tuesday afternoon, while Greg's car was in the driveway. I didn't go in angry. I didn't go in yelling. I went in holding an envelope, and I handed it to my wife, who was lying on the couch under her blanket in full sick person mode. And I said very quietly, "You don't want to look at that?" She opened it. She looked at it, and she looked up at me with an expression I will never forget, not guilt, not panic, but a kind of rapid calculation, like a computer running through options. Greg came out of the kitchen. He'd obviously heard me come in. He looked at the papers in Tanya's hand. He looked at me, and then, I swear this happened, he tried to play it cool. He said something like, "Hey man, this is between you and Tanya. Whatever's going on." And I said, "There's another envelope on the kitchen table, Greg. That one's got your name on it." His face did something very interesting. It went through about 6 emotions in 4 seconds. I watched it happen, and I felt the satisfaction that I will not pretend was entirely Christian of me. Raymond had filed a civil suit against Greg's LLC for the unauthorized receipt of funds transferred from my joint account. He had also forwarded everything to the county district attorney's office, who had, and this was the part one really appreciated, already been in contact. I said, "There are also 2 detectives who would like to speak with you today, I believe." And then I left. I walked out of my house, got in my truck, drove to my buddy Marcus's place. Wait, not Marcus, I can't use that name. Drove to my buddy Keith's place, sat on his back porch, ate half a pizza, and watched a baseball game, because I had done everything I needed to do. And now it was time to let the system work. The detectives did come that evening. Tanya and Greg both lawyered up immediately, which, honestly, if anything, told the investigators everything they needed to know about whether people with nothing to hide tend to lawyer up within the hour. The lab technician when contacted by investigators, folded within 48 hours. She gave a full statement. She implicated Tanya directly. She had been paid in cash twice to flag Tanya's blood work. She had documentation of the payments. She was scared, and she should have been scared because what she had done was not nothing. The divorce proceedings were a whole separate circus. Tanya's attorney tried everything. She argued that the transfers were marital spending. She argued that Tanya had been genuinely unwell and that the blood work situation was being mischaracterized. She argued that I was a controlling spouse who had driven Tanya to desperate measures. She was thorough, I'll give her that. Raymond was more thorough. The camera footage alone, 3 weeks of my wife moving around that kitchen with full energy, laughing, planning, eating normally, and then transforming herself back into a sick person before I got home, was remarkable evidence. I watched the judge watch it. I watched the judge's face do something I can only describe as controlled disgust. Tennessee divorce law operates on equitable distribution, which means the court tries to divide things fairly. Tanya had been counting on getting a significant portion of the house equity and our joint savings. What actually happened was that the court found, based on the evidence of the fraud, that she had engaged in deliberate financial misconduct during the marriage. This affected the distribution significantly. Her share of the marital assets was reduced substantially. The civil case against Greg's LLC resulted in a judgment requiring him to repay everything that had been transferred, with interest and with legal costs. Greg, it turned out, did not have nearly as much money as his sneakers, and his cologne suggested. He had been living on the transferred funds and his divorce settlement from his own marriage, which had run out. The judgment put him in a very uncomfortable financial position. The criminal matter involving the lab technician and the blood work fraud was a piece that had the widest consequences. Tanya ended up with a misdemeanor charge related to conspiracy to commit fraud. Her attorney managed to negotiate it down from the felony charges that were originally being discussed, and because she had no prior record and agreed to repay a portion of the financial damages, she avoided jail time. She got probation, a fine, and a permanent record. Not nothing. Greg did not negotiate as well. He had more direct financial exposure and less leverage, and his attorney was not as skilled. He ended up with a felony charge that, at the time of the final resolution of all of this, was still working its way through the system. I won't claim to know exactly how it ended for him, because frankly, once the legal process took over, I stopped tracking it closely. I had spent enough mental energy on Greg Holloway to last several lifetimes. What I do know is that his LLC was dissolved. His car was repossessed. And the last time I heard anything about him secondhand, he was living in a rental apartment somewhere in Memphis, which I understand is a perfectly fine city, but which is not, I will note, the lifestyle he had been funding himself toward with my money. Now here is the part we want to tell you most. Not the court outcome, not the legal process. The part that I think about when I think about how this whole thing ended. About 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I was at a hardware store. I was buying stuff to fix a fence panel on the back of my property. The house was mine now fully per the court's ruling, and I was slowly doing all the projects I'd put off during the months I'd spent being a full-time caregiver to a woman who didn't need caregiving. I was standing in the lumber aisle comparing pressure-treated boards, minding my own business, enjoying the simple peace of being a man with a fence to fix and nobody deceiving him. And I ran into Janet, Tanya's mother. Now, Janet and I had always gotten along. She's a small woman, around 70, with white hair and a habit of baking when she's upset, which means in the aftermath of everything that had happened, she had probably baked enough to fill a bakery. She saw me in that lumber aisle, and she stopped walking. I expected awkward. I expected tension. I expected maybe some degree of defensiveness on behalf of her daughter. What I got was an apology. She said, "Daniel, I'm sorry. I want you to know that I didn't know, and I'm ashamed." I stood there for a second, and then I said, "I know you didn't, Janet. I know." And she nodded, and she went on her way, and I stood there in the lumber aisle for a moment with a piece of pressure-treated wood in my hand, and I felt something that I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt like myself, not the version of myself that had been running on fumes and grief and suppressed suspicion for months, not the version that sat on the shoulder of Highway 9 with shaking hands, not the version that had to smile across the dinner table already knowing, the original version. The one who shows up on time, keeps his word, fixes things on weekends. The one who picks the same truck twice because he knows what works. That fence panel, by the way, took me about 4 hours to replace. I did it on a Saturday by myself, with country music playing from my phone and a cooler of cold drinks on the back porch. It was a perfect day. The kind of day that doesn't ask anything of you. The kind of day that is just exactly what it says it is. My neighbor Gary came out while I was finishing up and leaned on the fence and asked how things were going. And I said, "Better." He asked if I was seeing anyone, and I said, "Not yet." And he said, "You'll get there." And I said, "Probably so." I grilled burgers that evening, ate them alone on my back porch with the crickets making their noise, same as they always had. And I sat there thinking about what it means to be a person who pays attention, who notices when things don't line up, who doesn't react with emotion when reaction with evidence is an option. I thought about the camera, that cheap little thing that looked like a USB charger. $39 on the internet. The best $39 I ever spent. I thought about Tanya, and I want to be honest with you, not just about the anger, which you've heard plenty of, but about the sadness, because it was there. It was real. I had loved her, the woman she had been, or the woman I had believed her to be. I had loved that woman genuinely. And the grief of losing something you loved is grief whether or not the thing turned out to be real. That is one of the unfair things about the human heart. It doesn't get to choose what it mourns. But I also thought about this. She had spent over a year of her life performing, lying in bed, performing exhaustion, convincing me she was suffering, living inside a lie so deeply that she had to maintain it every single day, with every look and every sigh and every bowl of soup she accepted from a man she was planning to take the cleaners. That sounds exhausting to me, genuinely, more exhausting than anything I've ever done. And I once stayed awake for 31 hours during a supply chain crisis. That still sounds easier than being Tanya. And for what? She ended up with less than she would have received if she just filed for an honest divorce. She ended up with a criminal record. She ended up with a fallout of everyone in her circle knowing what had happened. Her mother apologizing to her ex-husband in a hardware store. That's what the plan got her. There's something almost instructive about that, if you're the kind of person who looks for lessons. The dishonest path, the one that seems smarter, the one that accounts for every angle. Sometimes it is just objectively worse than the honest one would have been. Sometimes the elaborate scheme produces less than the straightforward request would have. Not always. I'm not naive. But sometimes. I am not someone who believes everything happens for a reason. I think that's something people say to make pain feel less arbitrary, and I respect the need to do that. But it's not where I land personally. What I do believe is that you can make meaning out of things even if the things didn't have meaning built in. The meaning I made out of this is pretty simple. I got very good at paying attention to when something doesn't add up. I got very good at moving quietly and deliberately instead of loudly and emotionally. I got my house, my savings, my peace, and my truck. I got my back porch and my crickets and my fence that I fixed myself. I got to be me again. Turns out, that's a pretty good thing to get. If you stayed with me this long, and look, this was a lot. I know this was genuinely a lot. Then I want to say one thing, not a lesson. Because you don't need me to teach you anything. Just an observation from a man who has been through something. The quiet work, the careful work, the work nobody sees you doing because you're doing it before you say a single word about it. That work matters. It mattered here. It was the difference between losing half of everything I had and walking away whole. Pay attention to when things don't line up. Trust that feeling. Don't tip your hand. And if your gut is telling you something, go buy a camera. $39. Changed everything. One more thing. I want you to know that the Tuesday after everything went down, after the papers were served and the detectives came and the whole thing unraveled, I drove to work like usual. I got there at 7 in the morning. I did my job. I made sure the trucks were loaded right and the routes were correct and the schedules lined up. At 2 in the afternoon, I opened my camera app out of habit. The screen showed my empty kitchen. Still, quiet. The afternoon light coming through the window over the sink the way it always had. Nothing moving. Nothing happening. Nobody at my table. I stared at it for a second, and then I closed the app, put my phone in my pocket, and got back to work. Some cameras, once they've done their job, you just don't need to check anymore. And that, my friends, is where Daniel's story ends. Not with noise, not with chaos, but with a quiet kitchen, an empty screen, and a man who finally got his peace back. If this story hit you somewhere deep, if you found yourself nodding, holding your breath, or maybe thinking about someone in your own life, then you already know why stories like this matter. They remind us to trust ourselves, to pay attention, to never let anyone make you feel crazy for noticing what you notice. If you're new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and join this community, because we tell stories here that are worth hearing. Real emotions, real lessons, wrapped in narratives that stay with you long after you stop listening. And if this story moved you even a little, drop a comment below. Tell me what moment got you the most. Was it the camera footage, the soup, the Tuesday papers? I read every single comment, and honestly, your responses are what keep this channel going. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. You never know who's sitting on the shoulder of a highway somewhere, shaking hands, staring at a screen, trying to figure out what to do next. Maybe the story is exactly what they need. Until next time, stay sharp, trust your gut, and remember, the quiet work always wins. Take care of yourselves. See you in the next one.